She was 9 years old, full of excitement, and dressed in a homemade Halloween costume on what should have been one of the most fun nights of the year, and then she simply vanished into the cold October darkness, leaving behind a community that would never be quite the same again. The disappearance of a little girl from a quiet Wisconsin town on Halloween night in 1973 would become one of the most haunting and heartbreaking cases in the state's history, drawing thousands of volunteers, capturing national headlines, and ultimately revealing a shocking truth that took nearly a year to unravel, and a legal battle that would stretch on for decades. Alyssa Ann French was born on June 2, 1964, in the state of Wisconsin, and from the very beginning her life was shaped by the kind of ordinary Midwestern simplicity that makes cases like hers feel so deeply personal to so many people. When she was still very young, her parents went through a difficult separation and eventual divorce, and Alyssa and her mother relocated to a modest, tightly knit community called Fond du Lac, a small city nestled along the southern shore of Lake Winnebago in eastern Wisconsin. It was the kind of place where neighbors genuinely knew one another, where children played freely on the sidewalks until the streetlights came on, and where a sense of communal trust formed the invisible fabric of everyday life. In the years that followed the move, Alyssa's mother found love again and remarried, and before long Alyssa had a younger brother to share her home with, a development that seemed to settle the family into a new rhythm of stability and warmth. By 1973, when Alyssa was 9 years old, she was a bright, energetic third grader enrolled at her local elementary school, a proud member of her Girl Scout troop, and someone whose happiest hours were spent outdoors, running through the neighborhood with friends, climbing trees, and doing all the things that children in safe, unhurried communities do when the world still feels large and full of possibility. She was the kind of child that neighbors remember fondly years later, quick with a smile, curious about everything, and completely at ease in the world she knew. October of 1973 arrived the way it always does in Wisconsin, with crisp air, colorful leaves, and a particular kind of festive anticipation that fills the weeks leading up to Halloween. For Alyssa, the holiday was everything, and she had been excitedly planning her costume and her trick-or-treat route for weeks. Her original vision was to dress as a butterfly, a bright and joyful choice that perfectly captured her personality, but as the last days of October arrived, the weather turned colder than expected, and a butterfly costume simply wouldn't be warm enough for the evening ahead. Alyssa's mother, practical and resourceful as any parent of that era had to be, improvised a new outfit from items already in the house, piecing together a look that included a large black hat as its centerpiece. It wasn't the costume Alyssa had dreamed of, but she accepted the change with the resilience of a child who understood that the real point of Halloween wasn't the costume at all, it was the adventure. Alyssa had originally planned to make the rounds with a close friend from the neighborhood, the two of them going door to door together the way kids always did in those years. But at the last moment, her friend's plans fell through when the girl was disciplined by her parents and told she had to stay home for the evening. Rather than give up on the night entirely, Alyssa decided she would go alone. Her mother gave her clear instructions: stay close to home, don't go anywhere unfamiliar, and be back by 7 o'clock. The neighborhood around their home was widely considered one of the safest areas in Fond du Lac. Alyssa's parents knew virtually everyone who lived within several blocks in every direction, and on a Halloween night, when plenty of other children and their parents would also be out walking the streets, there seemed to be very little reason for serious concern. Adding to that sense of security, local parents that year had also organized a community Halloween gathering specifically designed to give children a controlled and supervised environment in which to celebrate. The occasion had been motivated, in part, by a wave of alarming news reports circulating nationally that season suggesting that some individuals had been placing sharp objects and harmful substances inside Halloween candy, a story that had terrified parents across the country and led many communities to seek safer alternatives to traditional door-to-door trick-or-treating. Alyssa planned to visit both the neighboring homes and the community gathering before returning home. She stepped out into the cool evening air at around 6 o'clock on October 31, 1973, her candy bag in hand, her large black hat sitting atop her head, and the whole familiar neighborhood spread out before her. She was supposed to be home within the hour. By 7 o'clock, she hadn't returned. Her mother waited, telling herself that the girl had probably just lost track of time chasing the excitement of the night, the way children do. But as the minutes ticked past and 7 became 7:30 and then approached 8, the familiar weight of parental worry began to deepen into something more serious. By 8 o'clock, Alyssa's mother went out to look for her. She walked the nearby streets, called her daughter's name, and began stopping anyone she encountered to ask whether they had seen a young girl in a black hat. She hadn't. Word spread through the neighborhood the way it only can in a small, connected community, and within the hour, neighbors began pouring out of their homes to join the search. They spread across the surrounding blocks in every direction, checking yards, peering behind bushes, calling Alyssa's name into the night. As the evening deepened and the Halloween crowds thinned out and went home, the search continued but yielded nothing. Police were called and officers joined the effort, expanding the search grid and interviewing residents. Through those early interviews, investigators established two important reference points. Witnesses confirmed that Alyssa had knocked on the door of a classmate's home and shortly afterward had visited the home of a teacher, both located only a few minutes' walk from her own front door. After leaving the teacher's residence, her trail simply went cold. The fact that she had apparently vanished within such a short distance of home, and so early in the evening, sent a chill through everyone involved. The search continued through the night, exhausted volunteers and officers covering every street, every vacant lot, every patch of open ground they could think of. But as dawn broke over Fond du Lac on the 1st of November, there was still no sign of the missing girl. As news of Alyssa's disappearance spread beyond the city limits and reached television stations across Wisconsin and then across the nation, the story took hold of the public imagination in a way that few missing child cases had before. Halloween was a tradition that millions of American families shared, and the image of a little girl in a costume disappearing, while doing something so completely ordinary and innocent, was almost unbearable to contemplate. Parents who had sent their own children out trick or treating that same evening found themselves thinking of Alyssa and her family with a grief that felt strangely personal. Within days, the search operation had grown into something extraordinary. Investigators coordinated with volunteers who arrived not just from Fond du Lac, but from communities across the region, and before long more than 5,000 people had joined the effort to find Alyssa French. Authorities printed thousands of flyers bearing her photograph and distributed them across the city and well beyond its borders. Local businesses rallied behind the search, with several gas stations along the main roads offering free fuel to anyone participating in the organized search efforts, a gesture that spoke to how deeply the community had been shaken. Volunteers on horseback covered forested areas and fields where foot traffic struggled to keep up. Others on all-terrain vehicles pushed into remote stretches of countryside that lay outside the city itself. Professional search teams and trained tracking units were brought in, and the operation became one of the largest search efforts ever conducted in that part of Wisconsin. Day after day, the search continued, producing nothing. Then on November 3, 1973, 3 days after Alyssa had stepped out into the Halloween night and disappeared, a farmer driving along a rural road near the small community of Taycheedah, approximately 5 kilometers from the French family's home, noticed something unusual on the shoulder of the road. 2 garbage bags had been left alongside the pavement, an odd sight in a stretch of countryside where litter was unusual. Like virtually everyone in the region, the farmer was aware of the search for the missing girl from Fond du Lac, and something about the placement of those bags gave him an uneasy feeling. He pulled over, approached the bags, and looked inside. What he found was a discovery that no one should ever have to make. One bag contained the remains of a young girl, the other contained her clothing. He drove to the nearest telephone and called the authorities immediately. The news traveled with terrible speed, and by the time police units arrived at the location on that rural roadside, a crowd of local residents had already gathered, standing in stunned silence along the shoulder of the highway. Officers arriving at the scene confirmed what everyone feared. The child was Alyssa French. She had been located, but not in any way that could bring relief. The body was transferred to medical examiners, who conducted a thorough examination and established several deeply troubling findings. Evidence indicated that Alyssa had been subjected to a serious and heinous attack prior to her death. The initial determination regarding the cause of death suggested asphyxiation, but further examination led the medical team to revise that conclusion, ultimately determining that the child had lost her life as a result of traumatic shock, a finding that underscored the terrifying ordeal she had endured in her final moments. With no DNA analysis available in 1973, investigators working the forensic side of the case had to rely entirely on physical trace evidence. Technicians meticulously examined Alyssa's clothing and gathered every material they could identify as potentially foreign, including small fiber samples that appeared inconsistent with the garments themselves, as well as a single hair. No fingerprints were recovered from any of the evidence, including the garbage bags that had been used to conceal the victim and her belongings, a detail that suggested the perpetrator had taken deliberate steps to avoid leaving behind identifying marks. The news that a child had been found under such devastating circumstances sent shockwaves through an already shaken community and reverberated across the country. People who had followed the search with hope were now confronted with grief and outrage. There was a widespread and urgent demand for accountability, and families everywhere who had sent their own children out on Halloween night felt the fragile trust they placed in their neighborhoods shaken to its core. Alyssa's funeral took place a few days after her remains were recovered, and the service drew an overwhelming turnout. So many people came to pay their respects that organizers had to establish multiple separate lines to accommodate everyone who wanted a moment to say goodbye to the little girl who had become, for a brief and terrible time, a symbol of something lost. While the community mourned, investigators pressed forward with very few solid leads and enormous public pressure to deliver answers. In the absence of physical evidence pointing to a clear suspect, detectives focused on reconstructing Alyssa's movements from the moment she left home on Halloween evening. Based on what they had learned from the two families she had visited, it appeared that she had barely begun her trick or treat route before something went wrong. The question was what exactly had happened in those final minutes after she left the teacher's home. Investigators considered two broad scenarios. In the first, some unknown individual had encountered her on the street and lured or forced her away. In the second, she had knocked on another door somewhere along that block and encountered danger inside a private residence. The first possibility was considered less likely by the detectives working the case. Alyssa was an experienced and sensible child, familiar with her neighborhood, and the likelihood that she would have willingly gone somewhere with a stranger seemed low, particularly given that none of the neighbors who had been outside that evening recalled hearing any disturbance or sounds of a struggle. The second scenario, that someone known to her had invited her inside, struck investigators as considerably more probable. Working from that assumption, police conducted a painstaking series of interviews with every household along the relevant stretch of the street. Every resident they spoke to denied that Alyssa had come to their door that evening. Investigators began the careful work of examining each family in detail, evaluating circumstances, looking for inconsistencies, and attempting to identify anyone whose background or behavior might distinguish them from the others. They asked Alyssa's mother directly, among all the families on that street, were there any that Alyssa had a particularly close relationship with, anyone she would have been especially comfortable approaching. Her mother provided several names, and investigators began following each of those leads in turn. One name in particular immediately drew their attention. Living on the relevant street at that time was a 34-year-old man named Gerald Turner, who shared his home with his girlfriend and their young daughter. There were several reasons why Turner stood out from the very beginning of that inquiry. First, Alyssa had known him well. He lived nearby, was a familiar face in the neighborhood, and was exactly the kind of person a trusting 9-year-old girl would have had no reason to be cautious around. Second, and far more consequentially, Gerald Turner had a documented criminal history that included prior offenses involving assaults against women and girls, a fact that immediately elevated his status in the minds of the investigating detectives. Third, and perhaps most telling in the context of those early interviews, Turner's manner when officers first spoke with him struck them as notably out of the ordinary. He appeared tense, gave answers that seemed carefully managed, and at moments seemed to demonstrate a curious familiarity with details of the investigation that a person with nothing to hide would not ordinarily possess. Officers questioned Turner but did not have the evidence required to make an arrest. What they could do was conduct a thorough examination of his residence, and in doing so they gathered samples from a range of items inside the home, including fibers taken from a blanket in his bedroom. When forensic analysts compared those fibers to the trace material recovered from Alyssa's clothing, the results were significant. The fibers matched. It was a meaningful piece of circumstantial evidence, but on its own it was not sufficient to support a criminal charge, and the investigation appeared to stall. Weeks passed, then months. The case remained officially open, but without new evidence there was little visible progress, and the community's anguish settled into a kind of unresolved grief that clung to Fond du Lac like a shadow. Then, approximately 9 months after Alyssa's disappearance, something that no one had anticipated occurred. Gerald Turner contacted law enforcement and told them he wanted to talk. He confessed. According to the account Turner provided in that confession, the events of Halloween night had unfolded in a way that was both calculated and opportunistic. Alyssa had come to his door while trick-or-treating, just as she had gone to the doors of her classmate and her teacher that evening. Turner had opened the door, given her candy, and then, in a moment of predatory manipulation, invited her inside under the pretext of allowing her to see his young daughter. Alyssa, who knew and trusted him as a neighbor, had no reason to be alarmed, and she stepped through the door. Turner led her to the bedroom at the back of the house, where he subjected her to a violent and deeply traumatic attack. During the assault, Alyssa lost her life, a result that, according to medical evidence, stemmed from the profound physiological shock her young body experienced during the ordeal. When Turner realized what had happened, the enormity and the terror of the situation apparently overwhelmed him. His girlfriend was expected home soon, and he needed to conceal what he had done before she arrived. He improvised in a particularly chilling way, pulling socks over his hands instead of gloves in an effort to avoid leaving fingerprints, and then placing Alyssa's body in one garbage bag and her clothing in another. He carried both bags out to his vehicle, drove the several kilometers to the rural road outside Táchira, left the bags on the shoulder, and returned home, completing all of this before Alyssa's mother had even begun walking the neighborhood in search of her daughter. That night, Turner sat in his home while the community outside mobilized, while sirens moved through the streets and neighbors called Alyssa's name in the darkness, and he gave nothing away. When Turner finally made this confession to investigators, nearly a year after the crime, the detail and specificity of what he described went far beyond anything that an innocent person could have fabricated. He knew things that had never been made public, procedural and physical details about the crime scene that had been deliberately withheld from all public communications. Investigators recognized immediately that the confession was genuine. Turner was arrested, and prosecutors began preparing their case for trial. The proceedings began within a matter of months, but almost immediately the prosecution encountered a serious and deeply frustrating obstacle. Shortly before the trial was set to begin, Turner retracted his confession in its entirety. He now claimed that police officers had authored the confession themselves and simply presented it for his signature at a moment when he was worn down by months of persistent questioning and pressure. He was innocent, he insisted, and the confession was a fabrication forced upon him by investigators who were desperate to close the case. It was a defense strategy that the prosecution was prepared to counter, and they did so on multiple fronts. Turner's former girlfriend, who had been entirely unaware of what had taken place inside the home she shared with him on Halloween night in 1973, took the stand and made clear her belief in his guilt. Forensic analysts testified about the fiber evidence connecting the blanket in Turner's bedroom to the trace material found on Alyssa's clothing, a physical link that placed Alyssa inside that room. And above all, prosecutors argued that the confession itself simply could not have been invented by anyone other than the man who had been inside that house on the night in question. The level of detail, the specificity, the knowledge of facts that only the perpetrator could possess, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. The jury agreed. Gerald Turner was found guilty of the killing of Alyssa Ann French and was sentenced to serve between 38 years and life in prison. For Alyssa's family and for the people of Fond du Lac, the verdict represented a measure of justice long delayed, and many believed that Turner would spend the rest of his life behind bars, where he could pose no further danger to anyone. That belief would prove tragically optimistic. In 1992, after serving approximately 17 years, Turner was granted early release from prison on the basis of what was evaluated as good behavior during his incarceration. Rather than being released unconditionally back into the general population, he was placed in a supervised residential facility, a specialized transitional environment designed for individuals with histories of serious offending, offering a structured life with monitored conditions and defined restrictions. For many, however, the distinction was cold comfort, and Turner's release ignited a fierce wave of public anger, particularly in the Milwaukee area where he was placed. Residents of the neighborhoods surrounding his new residence were alarmed and infuriated that a man convicted of the violent killing of a child had been permitted to return to something resembling ordinary civilian life after fewer than 2 decades, and they made their objections loudly and persistently known to local officials and state authorities. Those officials found themselves in a frustrating position. They lacked the legal authority to forcibly relocate Turner based purely on community objection, but they worked to challenge the decision through the mechanisms available to them. Ultimately, that effort bore results. Roughly a year after Turner's release, the corrections system conducted a formal review and concluded that the Parole Commission had made a significant procedural error in approving his early release, determining that Turner had not in fact been legally eligible for release at that time. He was returned to custody. Around this same period, Wisconsin lawmakers were working on legislation designed to address precisely the kind of gap that Turner's case had exposed. The proposed framework would allow individuals who had been convicted of serious assault offenses and who were assessed as presenting a continuing risk of reoffending to be transferred to secure medical facilities rather than released into the community at the end of their prison terms, with their detention continuing until qualified mental health professionals determined they no longer posed a danger. Alyssa's family hoped this law would provide the permanent solution they needed, but the legal system had more surprises in store. In 1998, Turner applied once again for early release, and in what many observers found deeply baffling, the reviewing commission declined to classify him as a dangerous sexual predator, a designation that would have subjected him to the civil commitment process and kept him confined. During the proceedings, former intimate partners testified about disturbing patterns of behavior Turner had displayed when denied what he wanted, accounts that painted a deeply troubling picture of the man behind the courtroom demeanor. Despite that testimony, the commission's decision stood. Turner was again released and placed in a supervised residential setting. That same year, in an incident that chilled those monitoring his case, Turner was reported to have made a threatening move toward a law enforcement officer conducting a routine supervision check at his residence, producing what witnesses described as a knife during the encounter. Remarkably, this development did not result in the immediate revocation of his supervised release. In the years that followed, Turner pursued what many found to be an audacious legal action. He sued a company that had declined to hire him, arguing that under Wisconsin law employers were prohibited from using a person's criminal history as grounds for denying employment. A court ruled in his favor, and the company paid him an undisclosed financial settlement. The case drew widespread disgust from the public, who felt the legal system had once again failed to reckon honestly with who Gerald Turner was. The situation remained unstable through the early 2000s, with Turner living under supervision in a specially designated facility while authorities monitored his activities. Then in 2003, investigators conducting a compliance visit to his residence discovered disturbing material on his personal computer, an extensive collection of graphic photographs and videos that had no legitimate purpose, along with recordings of films about serial killers, all of which Turner was expressly prohibited from viewing or possessing under the conditions of his supervised status. He was arrested, tried, and a judge sentenced him to an additional 15 years of incarceration. Alyssa's family and those who had followed the case for 3 decades dared to hope that this time the outcome would be final, that Turner would grow old behind bars and never again present a threat to anyone. Once again, those hopes were not fulfilled. When Turner's 15-year sentence approached its end, the reviewing commission declined to extend his confinement, setting a projected release date of 2018. Alyssa's mother, who had never stopped advocating for justice and had spent years ensuring that the public and the authorities never forgot what Gerald Turner had done, responded with determination. She launched a formal petition calling for Turner to be kept away from the public permanently, gathering thousands of signatures from across Wisconsin and well beyond the state's borders. The petition drew renewed media attention to the case, reintroducing a new generation of readers and viewers to the story of the little girl who had gone out for Halloween candy in 1973 and never come home. State officials, moved by the family's advocacy and the weight of public concern, aligned with the effort to pursue civil commitment proceedings that would transfer Turner to a secure psychiatric facility rather than allow him to return to the community. Turner's legal team mounted a sustained challenge to that effort, and the proceedings stretched through multiple hearings over the course of several years, with scheduled sessions repeatedly postponed as both sides argued their positions. The extended legal fight finally reached a pivotal moment in 2022 when a judge issued a ruling that Turner did fall within the scope of the civil commitment law, concluding that he continued to represent a genuine danger to others and that transferring him to a secure medical facility rather than releasing him was the appropriate outcome. Turner's attorneys promptly filed an appeal, and that challenge continues to be litigated to this day. As matters stand, Turner remains confined within a secure treatment facility and is now approximately 75 years old. Those who oppose his release argue that age offers no guarantee of safety in a case with the history that his has, and that the pattern of behavior he has demonstrated across 5 decades provides no credible basis for confidence that he poses no further risk. It is also worth noting that while Turner spent years formally denying responsibility for what happened to Alyssa, his own words at key moments have told a different story. On the day he was to be formally sentenced, as he passed Alyssa's mother in the courtroom, he looked at her and said, quietly but clearly, that he had not wanted to do what he had done, a remark that no innocent person would have any reason to make. Years later, while incarcerated, he wrote a letter addressed directly to Alyssa, in which he expressed remorse, and according to those with knowledge of the letter's contents, explicitly acknowledged that he had taken her life. And on at least one occasion, Turner reportedly observed that had the crime occurred on a night other than Halloween, the high level of public attention it received would never have materialized, a comment that revealed not only awareness of his guilt, but a calculated, chilling perspective on the circumstances that had led to his capture. For Alyssa's mother and the broader community that has carried this case in its memory for more than 50 years, the legal battle is not over. Turner's most recent appeal remains pending, and the final determination of where he will spend his remaining years has not yet been made. What has been made, long ago and beyond any reasonable doubt, is the determination of what happened on Halloween night in 1973 in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, and to whom it happened. a 9-year-old girl named Alyssa Ann French, who stepped outside in a homemade costume to collect candy from her neighbors and instead encountered a man who chose to destroy something irreplaceable. The community she came from never forgot her, and the people who love her never stopped fighting in her name.